Hello, I'm Jo Coburn. Welcome to New Summits, brought to you by Project Syndicate. When they look back at 2021, future historians may well see this autumn's COP summit in Glasgow as the most significant event of this year, and the competition stiff. There is a chance that this autumn will herald the turning point in humanity's fight against the worst excesses of climate change. Now, the IPCC say it's code red. The real question is what we do now. To help us answer that, over the next 3 hours. Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland. Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Paul Polman is the former CEO of Unilever. And we'll hear from Mark Malloch-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations. Andrew Steer, the CEO of Bezos Earth Fund. Laurence Toubiana is the CEO of European Climate Foundation. And we're joined by Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. And that's just for starters. Now, enough of the bigwigs. You, the audience watching, are the most important part of the conversation today. So do please comment and share copiously on your social media using the hashtag #NewSummits. In just a few moments, we'll be coming to our first panel of the day, asking whether the discipline of economics is up to the task of tackling climate change. But first, here's former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark.
Greetings from New Zealand. Today, we're coming together to discuss a topic no less important than the future of life on Earth. A climate emergency confronts us. Every new season brings frightening new events. From extensive fires and flooding to heat waves, huge storms happening with greater frequency and severity than ever before. This climate crisis is an existential threat to all humanity, and its burden falls so heavily on children. A 2021 UNICEF report found that over 1 billion children live in countries at extremely high risk of suffering from the impacts of the climate crisis, and it called it a child rights crisis. Children are at greater risk than adults from extreme weather, heat, and air and water pollution, and from the growing exposure to vector-borne diseases in new areas where they have become endemic. As well, many children are suffering from eco-anxiety about the state of our planet, and with good reason.
Never give up. We will continue.
On every continent, school children have participated in the School Strikes for Climate movement. They know that time is running out to act. So, will ours be the generation that finally acts? Or will it be one which lets children and young people down? During today's discussions, I would urge all speakers and participants to keep children and their futures at the forefront of what we say. Children haven't asked for this crisis, but they will have to deal with its consequences. The COP26 climate conference is due to take place in Glasgow in November. Governments have made commitments around decarbonisation and climate financing, but to date, when we add it all up, the collective commitments are just too small to enable us to reach the ambition of the Paris Agreement. So today, can we ask hard questions, such as why do governments continue to subsidise oil and gas in the face of irrefutable science on the damage which their use is doing to our climate ecosystem? Hard questions like, are we willing to accept the injustice that those who contributed least to the climate crisis, including the world's children, are facing its worst consequences? In 2020, I co-chaired the WHO UNICEF Lancet Commission. Its report was a future for the world's children, with a question mark. Our report showed that no country is doing enough to protect children's health and well-being, and we concluded that countries need to consider children in all policies for healthy, sustainable development and a livable future. That's why I'm pleased to support Project Syndicate's summit today on the commitments needed to address the climate emergency. The best time to address that emergency was when scientists first started sounding the alarm decades ago. But the next best time is now. Thank you.
Helen Clark there, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Now, before we come to our first panel, a reminder that we've got more coming your way next Monday, October the 20th, at the same time, when we'll be hearing from Jeffrey Sachs and others in the second instalment of Project Syndicate's Climate Week coverage, Building the Green Consensus. And you can register now at the Project Syndicate website. But to kick us off, I'm delighted to introduce the esteemed panel for our first session of the day, the New Green Economics. Welcome, first of all, to Darren Acemoglu, Professor of Economics at MIT, Anne Pettifer, Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, Mampila Rempile, Co-President of the Club of Rome, Co-Founder of Reimagine SA, and Gernot Wagner, Clinical Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at NYU. Welcome to all of you, and we'll come to them in just a moment, but first let's remind ourselves of the issue.
The world's worst economic crisis since the Great Depression.
The UN landmark climate report, Code Red for Humanity. Without big reductions in global carbon dioxide emissions, the world cannot win the fight against climate change.
Now, before we get started, just one more reminder that if you'd like to join the conversation or help share the word today, we'd be delighted. Get involved using the hashtag #NewSummits. In about half an hour, we'll be taking questions to the panel from journalists from around the world. But let's start today with questions from me to the panel, starting, Darren, with you. Throughout history, the opinions of different experts have held great sway, whether it's religious leaders, military leaders, or any other important vogue. I mean, how important are economists in shaping the world we live in today?
Well, a lot of things we do today in the modern world is not based on coercion, which is what most of human history has witnessed as a defining feature. Today, we are persuaded to do certain things, and we are persuaded by media, experts, politicians, social networks, and of course, social media today. And I think experts are important. I don't think you can single out the expert class by saying they shape everything, but if experts give you the wrong framework or don't raise the alarm bells, I think that's very important. And I think in the case of climate crisis, all sorts of experts are to blame, but I would say economists too. We haven't paid enough attention to climate. And when we have paid attention to it, I don't think we have used exactly the right tools. We've been too optimistic. We've underestimated the costs, the risks. We have not put enough weight on future generations. So I think there is a big readjustment. But on the other hand, I also would like to add that economists have brought one important dimension to the table that I think remains important.
Yeah.
We have to think about the costs and the benefits. And we have to find the best way of getting to what we want, stopping the climate emergency, reducing fossil fuel emissions, but how to do that at the lowest cost possible. And I think the cost here is very important because we don't want to turn our back on economic growth. Today, still, about 5 billion people live under less than $10 a day.
Okay.
So the world cannot afford to give up on poverty reduction.
Okay, well, let's stick with some of the issues raised there by Darren. Mampila, you've been a successful businesswoman and the managing director at the World Bank, an organisation run by professional economists. Picking up on what Darren has said, do you agree that while experts are important, some of the blame for the mess we are in today when it comes to climate is also down to experts like economists?
Absolutely. I believe that economists' love affair with economic growth is what has got us into the planetary crisis that we face. Not they alone, but they've contributed a considerable amount. I am a co-president of the Club of Rome. As you know, we published that report 50 years ago, The Limits to Growth. The modeling that was done there took into consideration nature. I was shocked to read in our briefing that many economists, mainstream economists, still do not see nature and nature systems as interconnected, inextricably linked with the well-being of not just us as human beings, but of our planet. And so I believe that the issue is not about alarm bells or costs. There is no cost that you can attach to saving lives. And I think COVID-19 has shown us that, in fact, even governments that normally want to keep debt to GDP ratio, they had to print money to save lives. So my conclusion is that what we need as humanity is a shift in mindsets to stop thinking of ourselves as apart from nature. Lowering carbon emissions is not enough. We need to change the consumption patterns that lead or that drive up those emissions. And we've got to stop the love affair with measuring well-being and the future of humanity through GDP.
Okay, well,
well-being is what matters.
All right, well, Darren, just to respond to that before we move on, do you agree there is an obsession, has been an obsession with economic growth over everything else?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, sure, if you look at it as saying, some economists have ignored climate, absolutely. And if you're gonna blame that on an obsession on economic growth, I'm fine with that. Or if you say some economists have ignored other problems, inequality, other hardships that have been created in the name of economic growth completely. But let's not forget that today we live in a world that's unimaginable by people 250 years ago in terms of health, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of, I think, one of the things that matters a lot. Sure, every life matters, but how you live that life matters also. 250 years ago, the majority of the world's population worked under coercion. Today, a lot of people have started being able to make decisions for themselves, and I think that matters a lot. So the question is, how can we bring technology and institutions in a world that provides better well-being? I completely agree with that, but I don't think we can do that without the right type of technological change.
Right, well, you brought up the issue of technology and that people can do things for themselves. Gernot, just take a look at these shots of Poland in the late 1980s. Now, communist countries had an awful record when it came to environmental protection, which perhaps suggests that the problem is technological. Do you agree?
Well, it's all of the above, right? So technology certainly matters. I'm decidedly of two minds. Let me put it this way. So I just raised I'm still sweating because I just taught a climate economics class earlier today.
We'll forgive you. We'll forgive you.
Okay, so I don't have a driver's license. I live in, right? Here's my apartment and so on and so forth. Behavioral change matters. Yes, of course. Technology allows lots of that. Meanwhile, the class I taught, literally the title was Why Benefit Cost Analysis Should Reign Supreme, right? A very biased statement on the one hand. On the other, we spent 45 minutes essentially talking about the inherent biases in the very practice of doing these sorts of benefit cost analysis, where, for example, to the technology question, right, our costs assumed in sort of these standard climate economic analyses have been overestimated over and over and over again. Why? Because learning by doing, economies of scale, lots and lots of factors that lead us to underestimate the benefits of cutting CO2 emissions, overestimate the costs of cutting CO2.
Well, let's put that to Anne. I mean, do you think, Anne, that economics needs to be remade from perhaps its sort of traditional sources?
I absolutely do. I have to back up what Mampela has said, which is that, economics, and I have to disagree, I must say very strongly with Darren, economics has focused relentlessly on growth, on infinite expansion, as if, the economic and the ecosystem is a one-way street and the only way is up and over the hill, right? And that doesn't understand and doesn't work within the finite nature of the ecosystem, of nature, if you like.
Does there need to be a cost-benefit analysis, though, Anne, as Darren was saying?
Well, the question, I think that Gunnar had it absolutely right. What are the costs and who is deciding? I mean, one of the big things we have to address today is that 50% of the world's carbon emissions are generated by the top 10% of the population. And so when Darren says that, we've all benefited from this, it is true that there has been a general rise in living standards, but my God, have the 1% done well and have the 1% grab very large chunk of the global economy. And the economics profession has stood by and watched that happen and enabled that to happen and got itself lost in cost-benefit analyses and forgotten to see the big picture. And I'd also like to disagree on the question of coercion. Governments are coerced by capital flows to behave or to conduct their economies in one way or another. In the case of South Africa, for example, South Africa was coerced by Wall Street's determination to flood money out of South Africa at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic and aim it straight at the dollar, at Wall Street. That was a form of coercion which lowered the currency, increased the value of the dollar relative to the debts they had to pay, and so on. This is...
We've just lost Anne momentarily. I'm sure she will come back.
We've never known in history private, unaccountable capital markets.
OK, I mean, Darren, you'll want to respond perhaps to some of what Anne was saying, but I'd just like to move the discussion on a tiny bit and say, if you were given a magic wand that could change economics instantly, what would it be? What would your first wish be?
Is that for me? Okay.
Me?
Darren. No, I'll come back to you, Anne.
OK. Well, look, I'm not going to apologize for economists being interested in economic growth. I will repeat the same thing, which is I think economic growth has brought tremendous amount of benefits, and even for the people at the bottom 50%. In the 1700s, life expectancy in the richest parts of the world were around 30 years. Today, in the poorest parts of the world, life expectancy is about 60. But I would say we have used a lot of the resources we have in the world in the wrong way. Sure, I completely agree with Anne that we've had a hugely non-shared, unequalizing growth. And we have created a situation in which a small fraction of the people have become very strong, amazingly dominant politically and economically. But I wouldn't say that economists are to blame for that. I mean, politicians and society are as much to blame. We have completely supported the big tech's conceit that they are doing well, while also destroying a lot of things.
Okay.
And don't forget, I think the same, call it obsession or focus on economic growth, in the 4 decades that followed World War II went together with reducing inequality and creating much better health and social conditions and working conditions, voice in workplaces. So it's about institutions, about how do we structure the institutions and technology so that we can create growth while at the same time reducing poverty and also reducing the environmental damage, which I completely agree is an existential risk. But if we turn our back on economic growth, if we turn our back on technological change, and if we turn our back on markets, I think we're going to completely undercut our efforts of both solving the climate crisis and poverty reduction.
Well, funnily enough, everybody wants to come in on this. I can see Gernot and Anne. But just before I come to both of you, Mampila, what's the most radical change you'd bring about in economics?
I would make sure that economists don't get away with talking to us about cost benefit when they externalize all the ecological costs and internalize to those firms the benefits and the profits. That's why we've got this inequality. And I disagree with Darren about life expectancy. I come from a continent which is a mother continent. People used to live for at least over 100 years. I grew up with a grandmother who was 100 and something and still walking. So please, let us not reinvent history. And also the issue about coercion. The people who came to introduce coercion plus on my continent were Europeans. And they dismantled the indigenous governance, technology, science, which started here anyway, and replaced it with the kind of extractive economic systems that included slavery, selling people, really. And so I think we need to put everything in a historical perspective and recognize that there was democracy long before the colonial process, and that people had, when we talk about love affair with economic growth, is the type of economic growth that's driven by so-called markets. Economic benefits are local. If people locally, every community locally generates the products and services they need, and then you have a nation which develops in harmony with nature.
All right. Well,
that's
OK, well, look, I'm going to show everybody these pictures from the climate group Extinction Rebellion. And they are obviously pushing their campaign for degrowth. That may be a new term for some people, but the idea perhaps that some of you have been talking about, that economic growth shouldn't be of primary concern. Gernot, where are you in terms of what you would change and perhaps what's stopping economics or economists actually coming forward with new technological ideas?
I'm not sure it's the task of economists to come up with the technological ideas, right? So actually, let me take a small step back here. But I would say the blame that is often levied at economists is very much a projection of something very fundamental. I do not like to, I don't want to dismiss any of the criticism, right? Every ton of coal, every barrel of oil we burn causes more in negative external damages than it adds value to GDP. There is lots and lots and lots wrong with that factoid, right? With that fact. But it's the misguided market forces that cause that to happen. So yes, right. So in sort of Econ 101 speak, right? To throw a few technical terms around.
Yes.
Yes, of course we need to internalize the negative externalities. Yes. Now, is that the economists' fault? I mean, no, it's also economists who came up with these convoluted technical terms that says that's exactly what we need to do, right? So, of course, it is a massive, massive political problem. And yes, there are inherent biases in how economics is taught, and Econ 101 biases things toward one side of the political aisle. And therefore, right, it's easy to point to, oh, economics tells us to do this, even though, right, Economics 102 has a very different set of conclusions. That said, I don't want to say it's economics per se, if really what's at stake here is, right, massive vested political interests that right now, as we speak, we are debating a carbon tax here, in the Senate, part of this massive infrastructure package of $15 per ton of CO2, right? 15 is better than 0. 15 is not where we need to go. So, is it economists' fault? No. Is it a massive political problem? Yes, of course.
Right. I mean, and though, is there something preventing radical thinking in the world of economics, or economists being prevented from coming forward with radical ideas that challenge perhaps the status quo?
I think that is the case. I mean, the economics profession is dominated by what we call orthodox economists, neoclassical economists who have very old-fashioned ideas about how we should be running the world, but who are also the architects of the international financial system under which we live. We live under an international financial system which has been designed. It is man-made, and I mean man-made, in the sense that we have constructed a system based on liberalization, deregulation, on the market deciding everything. Markets have to decide whether or not they will invest in decarbonizing the economy. Those invisible markets that we never elect, we don't appoint, we don't know who they are, but they decide whether or not. So it's that principle of handing over governance of the economy and the ecosystem to markets, to invisible, unaccountable markets. That was designed by economists, and many economists will go to the wire to defend that system.
Right.
I'm against that. There are alternative systems, and we've lived under alternative systems. We've prospered under alternative systems, but many of the orthodox economists won't think about that. You won't give thought to that.
OK, just before I come back to you, Darren, don't forget to join the conversation and help spread the word using the hashtag #NewSummits. Darren, do you want to pick up on some of what Anne was actually saying, but also this idea that people don't want to be scared off radical change or radical ways of tackling climate change? Is there a risk of that?
Well, I actually, I'm not sure whether I agree with everything that Anne wants to say, but I think the words that Anne said, I completely agree with. We need better markets, regulated markets, better institutions. We can create prosperity. We can create much less environmental damage. I think all of those I agree with. And I also agree that, as I said at the beginning, a lot of the choices that we make, we're made because we are persuaded, and sometimes we're persuaded by politicians, by big corporations. I think the role of big corporations is much bigger than those of economists, but economists have played a role too. I completely agree with that. But I think we have to be careful about what we mean by radical solutions. Yes, I am all completely for radical solutions, but we also have to take into account what are the fundamental institutional features that we want to preserve. And I think we want to preserve democracy. We want to preserve people participation in political and economic decisions. And I don't see any other way of doing that than a market-based economy, but bolstered by good regulation that reduces the power of big corporations, regulation that makes sure that market incentives don't lead to the worst types of behavior. And again, these have been part of economic thinking, for the last 2 centuries. I mean, all of the ideas that we are talking about right now go back to Alfred Pigue's Economics of Welfare in 1920, which was all about how if you go after market incentives and take actions that pollute, that's going to be terrible. So I think it's a question of how do we take the right institutions that we built over the last 300, 400, 500 years and preserve the better parts of it, which, for example, we saw work much better in the decades that followed World War II. And we throw away the parts that haven't worked. And especially we pull back from the wrong-headed deregulation, the wrong-headed empowering of corporations, and the wrong-headed empowering of politicians to look after the interests of big corporations.
OK, well, Mampila, 50 years ago, the Club of Rome published a now famous report called The Limits to Growth. It was presented in 1971, published a year later, and it warned about the unsustainability of exponential economic and population growth. Now, the report drew a lot of criticism from professional economists, but it was also quite prescient about the problem of carbon emissions. Now, it seems some of the ideas we are talking about today are 50 years old. So why do you think it took so long to seep into the economics mainstream?
For precisely the reasons that Anne was talking about. I mean, Darren can talk about better regulated markets, corporations that are regulated, and financial, but we have financialized economics across the globe. And a country like mine, even though they might want to take a different path, they get put under enormous pressure. So why the Limits to Growth, which sold 30 million copies, did not shift the needle in terms of mindset, is because of vested interests. That what people want is to focus on short-term gains of this drive for more and more economic growth. At the end of the day, I don't know how Wall Street, which is a runaway train, can be better regulated. And the worst thing is that these financialized economic policies and practices across the globe are generating fake wealth. It's all fake. And that's why I worry about this push for technology. You know, what's happening with Bitcoin and what further distraction it is rotting on a country like the Congo, where they mine these rare earths, all in the name of we are enhancing technologies, enhancing the quality of. I think every technological innovation should answer the question, is this going to lead to better well-being for all people and a healthier biosphere? If the answer is no, then that technology should not be pushed forward, because we have one planet. We are not going to be able to reinvent another planet. And to talk about reducing emissions, we are past midnight. And the Limits to Growth predictions have just been analyzed by many, many authors and scholars. They were spot on. But what will make a difference is mindset change. That mindset change comes about if we understand we are part of nature. It's not about us doing something to nature. We are part of it. Whatever we are doing to nature, we are doing to ourselves. That is called suicide in my medical world.
I'm going to take a quick pause there. I can see, Anne, you were nodding away, because it's time to open up the floor to journalists from around the world. We're going to take a question from Catherine Duan. I'm going to read it on her behalf. She's from the North American Bureau Chief of Sina Finance in China. And her question is clean technology the only solution to current environmental problems? Anne?
No, I mean, I think what we have to do is transform the way we live, essentially. I just want to say on growth, we've got to drop that term because it's just not sustainable. But we do want to maintain employment, and we do want to ensure that people have enough food. In other words, I think we need an economy where we address our needs and not our wants, you know, what Mandela calls fake wealth, our desires. And our needs are limited. So, you know, if we had an economy that addressed those, and we don't often need technology to do that. We know how to do it here and as you know, in our local environments. So I think there's delusion that technology is going to save us, when really what has to save us is a sense of sufficiency, that we have enough, actually, that, you know, what we need is to be able to survive, to have health, to have a roof over our heads, to have education, perhaps to give safe childbirth. These are fundamental needs, and we don't need any more. We've got the technology. We know how to address those needs. But instead, we're investing technology in inventing new wants, which, as opposed to needs, new wants, new desires. And that, for me, is the problem. You know, Bitcoin is a completely useless piece of technology, creating a completely useless asset. It has value only because we project some value upon it. It's a total Ponzi scheme, and yet it's burning up tons and tons of energy and emitting carbon and so on. And we're all sitting there with our arms folded saying, well, this is new technology, we can do nothing about it. That's absolute nonsense.
Right.
Money has always been a social construct. It's never been a technological construct.
Well,
it's always been a promise.
Let me get Darren to respond to that and some of the things that Anne has said about Bitcoin, for example.
Well, look, I think the mistake that perhaps many economists make, but many more people in the world make, is that all technologies are good. That's absolutely wrong. Technologies could be good, could be bad. It's what we make with our collective knowledge. Bitcoin, I completely agree. And so are all the technologies that enable us to pump more carbon into the atmosphere, and so are nuclear weapons. And so are technologies that enable big corporations and governments to monitor people and silence dissent. But on the other hand, let's not forget, today, if we have the smallest fighting chance to combat climate crisis, it is due to two things. One is a growing awareness, and I think is really important. And I think I applaud everybody on this panel who is really adding to that growing awareness, but also due to technological change. 30 years ago, solar and wind were 40 to 50 times as expensive as carbon. Today, they are cost competitive with carbon-based fossil fuels. So if we remove the implicit subsidies that we give to big carbon-based corporations, we can start engineering a clean transition. But more importantly, we have to tax carbon. And again, that's a market-based solution. And we shouldn't be talking about $15 per ton. We should be talking about 80, 100, perhaps even more, so that we can rapidly start changing behavior away from the things that involve creating damages and pushing people towards technologies that create damages. Bitcoin and other technologies like that, obviously we have to regulate them,
yes,
but that doesn't mean turning our back on technological change and economic growth.
Right, well, connected to what you've been saying, Darren, is a second question from Catherine Gennett. What price mechanisms can we use to persuade customers and businesses to switch to clean technology?
All of them, all of the above, right? So there is... not to turn into a linguist now, but actually, so here's some blame for economists. We as a profession have been, using the shorthand carbon tax, carbon price, for what frankly ought to involve simply, righting the wrongs of the past, of the present, creating the right incentives, using the power, the real power of the law of demand, right? The one law we have in economics, price up, demand down, works every single time, or at least CO2 isn't one of the very rare exceptions to this rule. But then essentially, take a very humble step backwards and say, how to then do that? And yes, there are more cost-effective ways and less cost-effective ways that are more efficient, less efficient, and so on. But how we do this is an inherently political question. So, the very first carbon regulation in my book is King Edward I, 1306. Right? Why? Well, he banned coal in his kingdom because his mom had asthma, apparently, all right? I mean, there was way too much soot in the air, right? So the burning of sea coal was banned. Now, of course, that ban and the death penalty for repeat offenders, stood for about a decade or so, right? Before it was vacated. And, one industrial revolution later, and by the way, one massive transition later, 1920, United Kingdom, some like 1 million people or so, 5% of the British workforce was working in the coal sector, right? Now, Anne and others, please correct me, but, it's 1,000 people and 2 coal plants, and none of them are currently running, right? And this is the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, right? Massive investments, massive technological change, amazing improvements on the clean energy front, some of it, unintentional, right? Margaret Thatcher trying to crush the coal union had nothing to do with climate policy. Well, one of the effects was to burn less coal as a result. Should we now be thanking Margaret Thatcher? No, but Well, but CO2 is lower as a result of this, right, unintended consequence. And, yes, it's all of the above. I know this is a cop-out answer, but of course it's technology. Of course it's, bigger government. Yes, not just, more effective government or whatever euphemism we want to use for this.
Okay.
Let's be blunt. We need bigger government than we currently have because we need regulation. We need to regulate CO2 out of the system. That takes regulation. That takes taxes, cap and trade systems, all of the above.
All right, well, let me put something else to you, Gernot, because we can all say economics needs to change, but when economists don't agree amongst themselves, we've had some disagreement here, what are policymakers meant to do? Let's just take a look at this graph showing the multiple models for calculating a social cost of carbon. It's coming up now. You yield vastly different results depending on whether you want to go with Nick Stern or William Nordhaus, both hugely respected economists, but one of them is surely wrong here, Gernot.
Okay, I would say all of them are wrong.
Okay.
Every one of these lines is wrong. We know that. There's lots, many more uncertainties here than can possibly be captured by a deterministic benefit cost analysis that says, and this is the right price per ton of CO2. Right? Daron before mentioned, 15 is surely wrong, should be 80, 100, possibly more. Yes, and frankly, I think the right answer is, 80, 100, possibly more, and we don't know how high it should be. But, and this is the big but, let's use some of what we know as economists about how, vested interests act and behave to tell us something what the price should be. So, for example, here in this country, in the US, we have some of the biggest polluters, Exxon, everyone's favorite pariah, but, plenty of other oil companies, who publicly, tacitly, but still, advocate for a $50 per ton of CO2 tax on carbon dioxide, per ton of CO2. In exchange, there's always something more here, in exchange for preempting more stringent regulation.
All right.
Right? Now, to us, sometimes that is presented as sort of, there's the purest view, Economics tells us that's the most cost-effective way to do, and more direct regulation will be cost ineffective.
Okay.
Another way of looking at this is to say,
briefly,
wait, therefore $50 to prevent more.
Okay.
You can translate all these other regulations into dollars per ton of CO2. So of course, they tell us they want 50 because they are afraid of there being more stringent regulations. Of course, that's what they would say.
I'm going to stop you there, Mampila, just briefly, because we're going to have slightly briefer answers to the questions from the journalists. But Mampila, you wanted to respond to what Gernot was saying.
Yes, this talk about price. When you talk about the UK and even those graphs, and Nick Stern is my greatest friend, are they calculating what the UK is exporting to countries like mine and so on by consuming goods and services that burn carbon in parts of the world like mine? Because if you don't factor that in, you actually have completely wrong calculations. And this is why this is not about the market being able to regulate it. Is mindset. This is a civilizational challenge for humanity. And I'm not saying we are clean in Africa. My own country is a polluter. All of us need to think about what is an ecological civilization that humanity has to work towards.
All right. Well, on that, let's go to a question from Jean Rognetta, editor-in-chief at Say Media in France. Jean, your question.
Yes, hello. My question is probably more academic or economic. How big a change of paradigm the green economics is going to be? We Say is the French edition of Project Syndicate, and we have been publishing articles from, I think, all of you, particularly on carbon price, in French, of course, but I feel there is a lack of understanding about the general equilibrium that goes behind that. I heard in the debate like a veiled possibility that the invisible hand is going to be replaced in the general consensus by something like the German ordoliberalism, like guided market theory. But how advanced are we? How dismal is going green economics to be as a science?
Darren, and then I'll come to you, Anne.
Well, I mean, I think we've never had the invisible hand. For the last 300 years, the government has always played a role. The last 40 years, the government has played a supercharged role in supporting big businesses and the wrong types of technology. So I don't think that is a big change. But I think what would be a big change is how we use that regulation. And I think within economics, I think greater recognition that not all technologies are good, greater recognition that we need to take the political economy into account, that we have to shape the institutions, greater recognition that climate change is a crisis, but also very importantly, thanks, Joe, for showing this Nick Stern Nordhaus thing. I think a very important part of that divergence is that Nick Stern was explicitly taking assumptions that said the future really matters. So I think we have to go much more in that direction. We have to sort of give up the conceit that we can just think about, maximizing some net present value of consumption. We really need to worry about what we're leaving to the future generation. And that involves the environment, but it also involves what types of technologies, what types of institutions, what types of poverty we are going to leave to the next generation.
Anne?
So, in answer to the question from the French gentleman, I grew up in a one-party state in South Africa. I'm a Democrat. I want a system which is governed by people, not by invisible markets. And that's not ordoliberalism. That is a managed and regulated and democratic system. That's what it is. It's about, what is the priority for the people of this country? What is the priority for the children, as Helen Clark reminded us? And the markets have no interest in the children's priorities and the future and their future. So, this is about people having some control and some say of the way in which their economy functions. And it's not ordoliberalism, it's democracy.
All right, next question from Dr. Olukayode Oyeleye, consulting editor, Business AM Nigeria. Your question. We can't quite hear you. Can you try again with your question? Otherwise, I've got it here. If you unmute yourself, we'll be able to hear you. Hey, we've got you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got you.
Okay, my question, part of what I wanted to hear had been dealt with by Ramphele, and I want to just build on that with particular respect to Africa, which is considered the continent of the future, with a lot of mineral resources and some other resources like forest resources.
Yes.
Now, we have a situation in which the twin problem of economics and politics, a lot of which is actually coming from outside Africa, will put Africa at a disadvantage. And by that, I mean, when we have a lot of our resources being extracted from Africa and exported elsewhere in the course of building green economy, how is it that Africa will not ultimately in the future be at a great disadvantage? Let me give a typical
I'm going to come in there. I'm just going to let Mamphela answer that because we've got to get through some other questions. Mamphela.
I believe that Africa has to lead itself, not through the aged people who are my age, who are at the heads of government. We've got brilliant young Africa. We've got the youngest population of all the continents. We need to use the resources we've got, the intellectual resources we've got there. Second, we've got 60% of what's left of arable land is here. But our politicians are selling it to foreign nationals. We also have the minerals, which we are not harvesting for ourselves. So I think the answers to Africa's issues is for us to go ahead and become much more focused on young, energetic, skilled young people governing the country, working in concert and implementing the integration of Africa's economy. We will be unbeatable. we will be able to have high well-being and a healthier biosphere, and hopefully set an example, like we did as the mother continent, of how to be human in the 21st century.
Well, that was a very upbeat note to answer that question. Thank you to Dr. Oyeleye. Ryan MacDonald, Sustainability Editor at Globe and Mail in Canada. Your question.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'd like to return to talk about carbon pricing and carbon tariffs. So the OECD has recently made a push to develop a global carbon tax or price, and this comes on the heels of a push for a global corporate tax. My question is a global price on carbon a necessity to avert trade wars, or can carbon tariffs work equally as well?
OK, Anne, you've only got about 30 seconds or a minute.
So I'm against carbon taxes and carbon tariffs. I think we've got to, first of all, invent alternative systems, alternative energy, transport, land use and agricultural systems to enable people to live and move and house themselves differently. Only then should we be thinking about taxing them. If we do it in the reverse order, we're going to get the sort of reaction that Macron got from the Gilets jaunes.
Thank you very much to Ryan MacDonald, and thank you to all of you, because that's all we have time for now. Thank you so much to our fabulous panellists for taking part. Now, to round up this session, the thoughts of former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn.
This is not a dream. We are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis.
An estimated 2/3 of the Earth's wetlands and half of the world's rainforests have been lost over the past 4 decades.
We must act now to conserve nature. But we should not be confused. This is an economic crisis too.
The impact of the ecosystem degradation on biodiversity, land productivity, and human well-being in Africa affected more than 485 million people, already costing an estimated 9.3 billion annually. The total cost globally of subsidies that damage nature is around 4 to 6 trillion per year.
Put simply, it is less economically costly for governments to conserve nature than to restore it once damaged, or continue with the current status quo. In the post-COVID world, finding innovative and economically sustainable ways to build back will be vital, and nature offers a solution.
Through new conservation strategies and the new 30 by 30 paradigm, which means 30% of our land and ocean mass to be protected by 2030.
We can not only be more inclusive of local communities and indigenous peoples, but governments can see significant social and economic development.
With Africa's population projected to double to 2.5 billion by 2050, job creation is the greatest challenge today faced by the continent. Nature offers exciting pathways to meet this challenge. In fact, studies show, for example, that the expansion in protected areas could generate twice as many jobs as more traditional sectors such as oil and gas.
Nature-based climate investments offer some of the best long-term value for money of any climate mitigation investments found today. From lowering operational costs to unlocking new revenue streams, to increasing customer engagement and to delivering public environmental good, conservation and nature-based solutions represent a massive opportunity.
The use of nature to contribute to development is particularly significant for low and middle income countries, especially mega diverse countries like Ethiopia, and should be supported by both bilateral donors and governments across the African region.
Therefore, supporting 30 by 30 is imperative for our long-term social, cultural, and economic development. This is not only for us, but for our children as well. I thank you for your kind attention.
Haile Mariam Desalegn there, former Prime Minister of Ethiopia. We'll be taking a short break, so do please check your emails, make a coffee, or get back to running your home school for 15 minutes. When we come back, we'll be discussing green capitalism. Is the private sector pulling its weight in the fight against climate change? Should governments be doing more to help it or humbly taking notes on what to do? Also coming up today, we'll have Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, Mark Mallet-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations, and Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. See you in a minute.
Climate change is now on the agenda of every company and financial institution around the world. There's a growing recognition that both the physical risks associated with climate change and the challenges and risks associated with the transition to a low-carbon future need to be on the agenda and need to be the focus of management and leadership of businesses all around the world. At RMI, we work to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, climate change is now on the agenda of every company and financial institution around the world. There's a growing recognition that both the physical risks associated with climate change and the challenges and risks associated with the transition to a low-carbon future need to be on the agenda and need to be the focus of management and leadership of businesses all around the world. At RMI, we work to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. Our mission is to help businesses and industries, cities and states, governments and policymakers drive the transition towards a zero-carbon energy future. In order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next decade, the energy system needs to be transformed. Energy represents almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And so, whereas it is 70% of the problem, it also needs to be 70% of the solution. Nobody can pretend that they can, on their own, find the solutions for the energy transition. This is a complex and massive challenge. So in all the work that we do, we look for partners and collaborators. We team up with other civil society organizations. We love to work with businesses, financial institutions to drive the change at a much higher pace.
People need nature, and people must take care of nature.
I am part of the next generation that have to make sure that this place survives.
It is our responsibility as the two-leggeds to try to foster good relationships with the earth. And it's beginning now.
Climate change is now on the agenda of every company and financial institution around the world. There's a growing recognition that both the physical risks associated with climate change and the challenges and risks associated with the transition to a low-carbon future need to be on the agenda and need to be the focus of management and leadership of businesses all around the world. At RMI, we work to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. Our mission is to help businesses and industries, cities and states, governments and policymakers drive the transition towards a zero-carbon energy future. In order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next decade, the energy system needs to be transformed. Energy represents almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And so, whereas it is 70% of the problem, it also needs to be 70% of the solution. Nobody can pretend that they can, on their own, find the solutions for the energy transition. This is a complex and massive challenge.
Hello, I'm Jo Coburn and welcome back to New Summits, brought to you by Project Syndicate. Coming up, we have Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever, Mark Malloch-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations, and Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. But today's biggest VIPs are, of course, you, the audience, watching around the world. The reason we're here is to start a conversation, and that needs you to keep it going. So do please comment and share widely on social media using the hashtag #NewSummits. Now, green capitalism is the subject of today's second session. So can markets shape the private sector into a lean, green CO2 fighting machine? Or does the state need to get involved?
I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
President Biden has often told us when he thinks of climate change, his first thought is about jobs.
We'll be coming to our panel in just a moment, but to help frame the debate, here's Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever and Vice Chair of UN Global Compact.
We come together at a crucial time, a critical inflection point. Many call it the decade of action. The world is literally on fire. The IPCC reports that the extreme situation calls for extreme action, with a window of opportunity regretfully closing very fast. The IPCC is equally explicit on the fact that if we want to keep well below 2 degrees of warming, it can only happen if we take drastic action now. The gap between what is needed and what is being done is actually regretfully increasing. We need concrete action. We need it now. We need to show the results between now and 2030. Scientists did their job. I believe it's now time for leaders to do theirs. I would argue in my book Net Positive, companies can simply not profit anymore by creating the world's problems. They really have to move rapidly to being part of providing the solutions. I call it moving from CSR, corporate social responsibility, being less bad, to moving to RSC, becoming a responsible social corporation. A simple question to start with would be, is the world better off because you're in it? Now we're seeing some trailblazers. Microsoft, for example, making commitments to recuperate their carbon emissions since they started in 1975. Walmart restoring oceans and forests to become regenerative. It is very clear that as we head to Glasgow for the COP26, probably the most important event of the year, there are some things that the leaders of this world, in business or otherwise, should be asking themselves. First, are my ambitions ambitious enough? Is the horizon of 2050 commitments really realistic or genuine, or is it too late? What are your 2030 commitments? Are we playing just simply not to lose, or are we playing to win and doing what we know is needed? The second question is, are you driving these partnerships needed to transform your industries? Because the scale of the challenges that we are facing requires radical collaboration. New partnerships need to be spun between public and private, developed and developing countries. It means working also with competition or across industries to solve the most wicked and stubborn problems of humanity. After all, I don't think we should compete on the future of humanity. But above all, it's about moral, courageous leadership to me, and that is needed now more than ever. As Rumi put it quite eloquently, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself. I'd like to thank you for all that you're doing. We need the best of all of us, now more than ever.
Strong words there from Paul Polman. Now I'm delighted to introduce the panel who can unpack all of that for us. May Boovy, Executive Director of 350.org. Jules Kortenhorst, CEO of RMI. Ella Cravey, Head of Capital Markets at the European Investment Bank. Katerina Pista, Professor of Comparative Law at Columbia Law School, and Hugh Fanstinis, Chair of Sustainable Finance at UBS. Now, in a little over half an hour, we'll be putting questions to all of them from journalists based all over the world. And just one more reminder that if you're in front of a screen wishing you could get involved today, the good news is you can. So get your phone out now and jump on the hashtag New Summits. Let's start our discussion for today. May, in your mind, how important is the private sector in terms of tackling climate change?
Well, thank you for the question. It's great to be with you. And first off, a disclaimer, I'm not an economist. I'm not a numbers person, which is perhaps ironic given the name of my organization. But the role of the private sector is crucial, but perhaps not in the way people think. I would describe the problem as a fairly simple one. On the one hand, we have people responsible for making decisions that extract more fossil fuels and drive up emissions that cause climate change. And on the other hand is all the rest of us. And it's not a good faith argument because the other side is sowing disinformation, lobbying, and adding to a false debate about climate action. What we need to see is courageous action, just like Paul Polman was saying, at that level of making hard individual choices about bold change that can fix the climate crisis now.
Right. I mean, in those terms then, Hugh, I mean, the private sector invests huge and growing amounts in green finance. I mean, we are seeing incredible innovation in areas like electric cars. Firms like Microsoft have pledged to be carbon negative by 2030. Is the private sector then in some ways closer to taking radical action than some governments and ordinary people?
Well, look, I think we've seen a huge pivot to a lower carbon economy over the last 18 to 24 months. And the private sector is now really investing at scale. I mean, just take the car example you gave, Joe. 83% of the capital expenditure by the US car companies over the next 5 years is for electric vehicles. There's been a huge pivot, but clearly we're only partway done. And I think as we look at it, we think there's probably about $3.5 trillion needed each and every year for the next decade to transform and rewire the economy to make it greener. And that's going to require public and the private sector coming together and quite frankly, a real focus on innovation as we were during the pandemic.
Right. Well, Hugh is talking about huge amounts in terms of an injection of cash to deal with this, Katerina. We heard in the opening Ronald Reagan, the former US president, famously saying the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Is it difficult for governments to intervene here without causing harm, or should they? Do we need them to do it?
Well, let's make clear that the government is already deeply involved in how the economy works. As I suggested in my book, the capital is coded in law. So the corporations that have been emitting pollutions benefit, or their shareholders benefit from limited liability. They themselves benefit from the ability of using the corporate form and spinning off into bankruptcy entities that might face too great liabilities. So I think there's a lot of subsidization of pollution going on through the regular legal system already. That has to be wound down, I think, before we even think about new forms of government engagement.
Right. So how much would you like to see that done with a sort of stick, if you like, trying to remove those subsidies from those polluting industries?
I don't see this as a stick. I'm basically saying we're just removing the mother of all subsidies, which is the legal protections of the current system that allows the pollution to go on. And then you can add to that some regulatory guidance to make sure that new investors are coming on board and investing into a better future. But I think you have to do both, because the logic of capitalism is, of course, to privatize the gains and to socialize the losses. And we have to put a stop onto that.
Right. Well, look, I'm going to show you all a graph, but Jules, I'd like you to comment, because it shows how GDP in the US has gone up, while emissions broadly have gone down. I mean, how much of this is actually down to the private sector acting of its own volition?
Thank you, Joe. Yes, this is definitely driven to a significant extent that improving the productivity of energy is in the interest of all of us. And so energy efficiency has improved over decades, and that has reduced the amount of emissions per unit of GDP. But we're not moving fast enough. As May pointed out at the very beginning, we have to move much more rapidly. And not only invest in the new things, you was referring to the massive amount of capital that is needed for that, but also retire capital assets that are still continuing to pollute. That transition is enormous, so the speed with which that curve is going to go down is going to have to dramatically increase.
Right, but I mean, is there a geographical dimension to this, Ella? Because in Europe, the EU and member states, on the whole, tend to be pretty keen to encourage the private sector to go green. But European emissions are only a small part of the overall picture. You know, how's the rest of the world doing?
Was it to me? Well, I think, yes, everybody is keen for the private sector to cut down their emissions. I'm sorry, I can't really comment that much on the rest of the world, but clearly there are regional differences. But I think it has to be done both by private and the government sector, or the public sector in general. We have heard this coming from the public sector now for years, that the public sector can't do it alone, but the private sector can't do it alone either. And private sector is driven very much by the financial market pressure, which may or may be efficient. It has done quite a lot of progress already, or caused progress. But I would also say that the public sector, the governments also need to do their share. And as Katarina was saying, for example, the subsidies, where do they come from? They come from governments. So they will have to stop that in all parts of the world.
Right. Well, what about the balance, though, between the two, May? Where do you think that actually lies, between governments and what they do and the private sector?
The simple fact is everyone has to do more. The science is very clear about this, as made most evident recently in the IPCC report. But there's an incredible amount of institutional inertia, both in the private sector and the public sector. We're talking about a physics problem, after all, right? And so the solution to inertia is momentum. We believe that actually the momentum comes from social movements. None of these institutions are acting of their own accord. Otherwise, we would not be facing the extreme climate impacts that we are today. It is the momentum that's been created by people all over the world pushing for more action. Unfortunately, the fact is that there's a little bit too much chumminess between elites in the climate fight, because those on one side and those on the other are a little too cozy with one another. Movements are what is forcing this conversation and turning up the heat where it needs to be turned up.
Right, Hugh, do you agree with that? Is it about social movement? We have Extinction Rebellion, obviously, and their climate change demands. Do you think we need to see more of that, that will make financial institutions and governments do more in the way May has said?
I think it's clearly part of the puzzle. We're seeing corporates see tremendous pressure, both from their customers, from pressure groups, from governments, and quite frankly, for their own self-interest. Because they also, I think what's really changed for me in the last 2 years is really that the companies are now seeing the opportunities as well as the risks if they don't adapt, whether that's electric vehicles, protein, plant-based foods, and so on and so forth. So I think there's real opportunities, and that's what's changing. But you also need to, you get to get a weight of support. And I'm particularly encouraged in finance that some work that former Governor Carney kicked off. Now almost 100 trillion of assets are across banks, asset management, insurers are all committed to net zero. So I think we are seeing, a movement, but we can always, as Jules said, we need to go faster.
Right. I mean, is there too much chumminess, as May indicated there, between the elites? Hugh?
To myself, I actually think that the underlying challenges of green, there's enormous political pressures. So to give you an example, we take Switzerland. In the last, about 3 months ago, there was a referendum about whether Swiss citizens should pay more green taxes. It got voted down. So I think this actually is not just about elites, it's about bringing the public with us on a journey and understanding what it means for each and every one of us, as well as for the corporate. So I think it's a much more complex, it's in your domain, Joe, it's a much more difficult political problem.
Well, it's always a difficult political problem. Katerina, do you think people do need to be brought along with the sort of radical action that is going to be needed by both governments and the private sector if they're going to have success in nudging people into changing their behaviours?
No, clearly the people have to be brought along. They both have to exert pressures on the elites, and of course they have to be a part of it. I think we shouldn't fool ourselves. This will be a costly transition. We have to think about sharing losses, not just trying to make gains and take opportunities. And if we have to share losses, our political leaders and also the people have to come to terms with this. This is not a win-win situation. And I think the more people realize that and the more they prepare themselves for that and demand similar sacrifices from others, the faster we can move.
Right. I mean, Ayla, one easy intervention from the state is to push for greater environmental transparency, making firms publish environmental strategies or their methodologies, labelling an asset sustainable. Is there a risk of adding too much green tape that will raise compliance costs, putting smaller companies at a competitive disadvantage?
I think initially maybe that is, of course, that is a cost and that is an additional workload. There's no denying that. But I think the good purpose definitely justifies it and people will get used to that. We have gotten used to so many things already in the past 25 years and even longer in terms of reporting, compliance. Everything was complained about at the beginning, but we have actually managed to find our way with all of this. And I think it is necessary because this is what I see also as a role of the government, to set the criteria, set the definitions. Otherwise, if there are no definitions out there, it's very easy to everybody to say that, look, I'm green because I'm doing X, Y, or Z. At the same time, with my left hand, I can do some very brown things. And we allow this. So this is something that I don't think we can avoid it. It has to be more transparent because otherwise, how can you tell the difference? And when you can tell the difference, you can also put a price on it because I find it a little bit hard to understand why. Well, I think a capitalist system is working largely pretty well, but it's a lopsided one because we let people who push carbon emissions into the air, who deteriorate ecosystems or water systems, or push pollution into the air or into the land or into the seas. They don't pay for that. And for me, they have some production elements or production costs which are not being charged to them, but which are being socialized. So to use a kind of old-fashioned black and white line there. So I think this is really the role what government should be doing.
Right. I mean, from the bank's perspective, Ayla, what works best, do you think, in terms of moving capital?
Well, like I said, I think you have to put the price to the capital where it should be. I'll give you one example. We, for example, when we evaluate any projects at EIB, we take into account, we calculate the financial viability of these projects with a carbon price which is far above the market level, and it goes up in the future as well. And then we can see that, well, this is perhaps not a viable project because we think that the carbon price is too low at the moment. And if you do this, then the cost of capital will go up for those who actually need to use that carbon, or need to emit carbon emissions. And this is the way you should be. You should just simply be putting a price to it, because right now it's true that banks are avoiding a little bit this very brown business because it doesn't look good. But this is going into the unregulated part of the market to private equity, hedge funds, family offices, and so on. But unless the price goes up, I don't see this changing very quickly.
Okay, Jules, did you want to respond before we move on?
Yes, I agree with Ellie that increasing the price associated with carbon emissions is a good thing. But we can't just count on a price on carbon. We need all the tools in the arsenal of governance, of civil society, and of the private sector to be deployed. So regulation will have to be part of it. Data transparency will have to be part of it. The incredibly important role of civil society and activist organizations that May highlighted earlier on is critically important. We need all of the tools in the toolbox.
All right, I'm going to just play you a clip talking of sort of politics and what politicians can do. Maybe I'll ask you a question afterwards. Let's have a look.
I think we can achieve things in the course of the next 4 years that will move the marketplace, the private sector, global finance, innovation and research, that in fact no political person in the future would be able to undo.
May, that was John Kerry, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Is he right that as it stands, any future politician will be able to undo the changes to the private sector that are going to come in the next months and years? And if so, why?
Well, we don't have time to scale back ambitious climate action that happens today. I think history has shown us that the best way to make sure that good policies last is if you have a strong public that is holding governments accountable. We're having this conversation during a pandemic. Many of us are probably speaking to you from our homes.
Yes.
We have seen how governments and the private sector can mobilize in record time when they believe there is a crisis right in front of them. So our challenge is to make sure that those same actors, especially central banks, realize that the climate crisis is going to make this crisis pale in comparison. And this is a tragic crisis we're living through right now.
Right. Well, Jules, then are new financial regulations and standards enough? Many would say that we need strong carbon taxation, something that doesn't seem to be on the cards in the US.
Once again, we really need everything. We need financial regulations. We need a price on carbon. We also need product standards and building codes. But we also see that the leadership in the private sector of CEOs and their boards that have now determined that this transition is going to happen and that they need to be part of it is equally crucial.
Right. Well, don't forget, by the way, everybody watching, to join the conversation and help spread the word using the hashtag #NewSummit. Katerina, can I just pick up on something with you? I mean, May mentioned the pandemic, and everybody knows that governments, to some extent, are strapped for cash, and it will be about priorities. Do you accept it's going to make it more difficult for them to spend money in ways that will behave, or change the behaviour, I should say, of firms and industries?
Well, I think the crisis has also shown that the government has much more flexibility than what is often asserted in the political discourse. So if we can mobilize a couple of $1 trillion, at least in some countries, I think you have to have your own currency, you have to be monetarily sovereign to be able to do this. So the US can do it, the UK can do it, the EU can do it with a European Central Bank on board. Not every country has that flexibility. But given that we've been able to do this, and we've basically pulled this off again, within 10 years after the last financial crisis, I think governments have more flexibility than is often asserted. This is not a private corporation, right? Governments can unilaterally basically pledge our future productivity, and that's what they're doing when they're issuing their money. And I hope that they get that and use the flexibility to move forward, and that the EU will do the same thing and will not get hamstrung by Maastricht and naysayers.
Right, okay. I'll get a response on that in a moment. But Hugh, then, where do you think the responsibility for how firms behave ultimately lie? Is it the shareholders? Is it governments and how they operate, where they operate, the workers? Who is it?
Well, look, I think it depends on each country exactly what the legal setup is, but increasingly the number of board members that I meet are really engaged in thinking about how their firms are adapting, what are the opportunities and what are the risks. And what I'm encouraged by, certainly going into COP, is that across finance at least, we're going to get much more disclosure. And I think one area where the UK is leading, and others I hope will follow, is having climate-related disclosures become a mandatory part of annual reports and quarterly results. And quite frankly, as we bring stuff into the light, people can then make their own assessments, and whether it's NGOs or pressure groups or shareholders or governments can then hold firms accountable. And so I think that data is a foundational piece. I'm very excited. I think we're going to see more progress this year.
Should more of that be mandated, as Hugh said, Ayla?
I think it goes both ways. Certain amount of information should be at least mandatory to be disclosed. Some can be, it doesn't all need to be, because if you talk about sort of a customer, consumer related companies, they need to disclose, in my view, even more, because their sort of stakeholders are out there dispersed all over the world. If you have large companies who are relying on a small number of large finance providers, those finance providers, i.e. their investors, will be very inquisitive already. And they will ask those questions bilaterally, whether they get the disclosures from the official sources or not. But I think the train has left the platform in this direction. Disclosures are growing. It doesn't matter if they are voluntary or obligatory, but people, investors, finance providers, banks, they are asking more and more information now from the companies that they are financing. Some of it is obligatory, some of it is for their own information. So I don't think we can go back on this one anymore.
OK, well, Katerina, the EU is looking at introducing carbon tariffs on polluting goods entering the bloc. It may be green, but does that stop it being protectionism?
I think when we may have to make choices like this, tinkering with, let's say, trying to say we have to have markets that are not distorted, or having no protectionism and are in favor of free markets. And when we face an existential crisis like the climate crisis, I would say, we have to do everything to stop that train crashing. And if that means that we take measures that might be deemed under different circumstances to be protectionist, I think that's a compromise I would be willing to make.
May, can I ask you the question that I put to Hugh a bit earlier, which is, where do you think the responsibility for how firms behave ultimately lies?
Well, look, 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of emissions since the dawn of the industrial age. And the science to attribute individual climate impacts to perpetrators, called attribution science, has only gotten better. So knowing who is responsible is no longer an issue. It's very clear. It's the fossil fuel companies and the financiers that are enabling them to keep in business. So that's the easy part. The hard part is getting governments to create that accountability. And that is why we force government action in country after country. And we've seen some inspiring examples of citizen action leading to impressive financial wins, particularly with the EIB. But we need to see more of that, and we need to see it more quickly.
All right, let me show you this graph, and Hugh, I'd like you to respond, because it's a lot easier for a firm to determine its revenues, expenses and profits than it is to assess its impact on the climate. How much of the problem depicted in these charts that we're showing is about a clear lack of data, or a lack of clear data, whichever you want to look at it?
Without having seen all the charts, it's probably going to be a little bit difficult to comment. But
do you accept the broad principle that it is more difficult to actually show and assess?
Well, I think actually, as I think it's just been said, I think actually the broad outlines are there. What we need to go is then to go into high resolution, so individual firms can understand much better their own footprints, the consequences of their actions, and also what's internalised and what's externalised. So, and I think I'm encouraged that companies are getting much better data sets. I think there's a revolution in green data which has started, and I'm very encouraged over the coming years how much of it's coming out. Now, it needs to be better quality, it needs to be more standardised, but I actually think companies are getting a much better sense. And a number of them, the leading companies, as Jules said, are setting their own carbon prices internally, so they're rationing their own usage. So I think there's a lot of good precedents which we can build on.
Jules, you're nodding away.
Yeah, I agree. We're making good progress, and data is not going to be a challenge anymore. What we don't have today, we will have tomorrow. So that will allow for much more informed decision making, but it will also allow consumers to make the choices that are driven by their motivations to reduce emissions. I think, back to your question, Joe, who's responsible here? If we provide good insight and good data to everybody, this is so much a shared problem for humanity. We can work on this together if people have the insights as to what their carbon footprint is.
Right, do you agree with that, Katerina, that it's about clearer data means we'll all know what's going on, so we can all make those judgments, and that will push this issue along?
I think it's too slow a mechanism for what we are facing. So disclosure can also be a fig leaf. We're disclosing everything. It's not clear really to what the markets will respond. So short-term traders or equity funds or hedge funds might still go for the quick killing and don't really care what the long-term implications are. We've spent decades discussing the discount factor, right, that we have to apply for the future damages of climate change so that investors might price this in. They have not done that. So I'm a bit skeptical to rely on disclosure alone. Of course, we want to have the data, but I think as we just discussed, I think a lot of the data about who are the perpetrators is already on the table. So we just have to take actions against them. And I think that is both regulatory action, it might be taxes and quotas, it might also be actually eliminating limited liability for investors who invest in these companies so that the financial sectors, the investors, fear some of the heat, not only through disclosure, but through the threat of liability.
Right, Elliot, do you think Katerina has a point there? I mean, we know that big corporations routinely shrink their tax bills, for example, through accounting trickery. Should we expect greener corporate accounting on paper to make anything greener in the real world?
Oh, I'm sure there's plenty of that going on in varying extents. I'm not saying that everybody's doing greenwashing, not at all. I think it's very difficult to say what is greenwashing, what isn't, and what is real, what isn't when you don't have definitions. And that's why I think these definitions, what is acceptable, what is close to zero carbon, and what is green enough. That is why we need these to avoid a kind of a jungle of different definitions. But I also agree with all the previous speakers who have said that we need a bit of everything. We need carbon pricing, pricing on all the other natural elements. We need regulation. We need disclosures. We need data. It's not a sort of one silver bullet that will resolve all the problems. We need all of it. And the good thing is that things are becoming more transparent. I don't need to go and dig up data on companies myself and look into their sustainability reports. And there are people and companies who are service providers who are doing this already. So this is developing a whole industry around these needs, which I think is quite encouraging. Whether it's fast enough, hard to say. I think we are still wasting a lot of time on supporting fossil industry, which is why I'm very happy that my company has decided to steer away.
Do you find that reassuring, May, that to some extent, yet the data is clearer, it's more transparent, there's more of it when it comes to investing in green industries? And although ESG is included in financial analysis and at least considered in the process of making investment decisions, is that enough?
No surprises here. No, I don't think it's enough.
That's why I asked you.
You know, I've been involved in a lot of debates about green capitalism since becoming a climate activist. But in the intervening 10 years, we have seen more dramatic climate impacts, and we have seen the rich getting richer. So to me, it is fairly obvious that we have not done enough. And at this late stage, everyone on this panel, everyone listening in, has incredible agency to make choices that are uncomfortable. But if they're not uncomfortable decisions, at this late stage of the climate crisis, they're probably not the correct decisions.
All right, Jules, I'm going to ask you to look at this graph that we're showing now. It shows green projects are receiving more debt issuances this year compared to fossil fuels. What do you make of that? Is this an early response to the Biden agenda?
I think it is definitely a beginning, and it is nowhere near enough. As you can see, there is still investment taking place in the fossil fuel industry. Most of that investment is going to be a stranded asset in the future. We know that. But more importantly, this is only about the flows of new financing taking place right now. And we need to address the existing portfolios of banks and institutional investors that have made historic investments in assets that are contributing to the problem. And we need to get those assets off the books. We need to close down coal plants, close down high carbon infrastructure and replace it with low carbon infrastructure. So it's an encouraging sign, but it's nowhere near enough.
All right. Well, I mean, you all know the COP conference is happening in Glasgow in November. Hugh, what is the primary thing that has to be achieved there? And picking up on what Jules said, is there a case and an argument to be made for transition rather than speeding up so fast that you don't take people along with you?
Well, look, I think I have two frames of reference. One is clearly the big picture, politics of this, which is clearly about the North helping the South transition, because clearly the need for green infrastructure in many emerging markets is intense. As I think about it through the financial lens, and having served for Governor Powell in the past, it's very clear that there are 4 pillars. There's around improving the transparency of the data, to provide stress tests on financial institutions that their portfolios are fit for the future. And I think this is an incredibly powerful tool. If every pension fund manager has to think, how am I investing? What will this look like in 10 years' time? It's unbelievably powerful. Third will be new markets. As all the panelists have said, and May said, carbon markets, green bond markets, new instruments. We need tremendous innovation. And then the fourth is really to help capital flow to emerging markets. And I think I'm relatively optimistic going in on the first 3. I'm quite a lot more cautious on the flow to EM.
How optimistic are you, Katarina, with COP coming up?
I'm a little skeptical. I think that the politics of it are difficult. I wished we could harness what we learned during the COVID crisis, that some cooperation, some just mobilizing of resources can really help, and that this could be channeled into climate activism. I keep my fingers crossed, but I just see the treacherousness of the politics.
What about for you, May? Are you optimistic?
I'm always optimistic, but I think that one of the key drivers, which Hugh said, is this question of transition and financing, and this $100 billion of finance that has been under discussion since the Paris Agreement. Let's just remember, this is pocket change for the people responsible for causing climate change. This should not even still be a debate, but yet we still haven't seen action. So what gives me hope about the COP is that this October, there are going to be mass actions all over the world targeting the financial sector, central banks, commercial banks, and insurers. That is where we're going to see pressure, and that's why I feel optimistic.
Well, just before I move off, are you at a risk, though, of alienating people from your campaign? Are you at a risk of turning people off the issues that you are so passionate about and saying are an emergency if you adopt the sorts of tactics, or not you necessarily, but other climate campaign groups adopt strategies that are so disruptive people can't support you?
We need a movement that everyone can feel part of, because climate change impacts everyone, of course. And so I'm not worried about that risk. I'm worried about not having a movement that is big enough for the challenge that we face. And I think with the latest IPCC report, the good news is 5 times more people read it than in previous reports. We love that. But are those people going to feel despair because of the late stage of the crisis? That is where social movements come in, to welcome people to know there is so much that they can still do to fight this fight. And I want to draw people's attention to a report that came out yesterday about young people. 50% of young people around the world feel intense anger and anxiety at their governments for not acting on climate change. So the biggest risk is actually not about alienation. It's about not responding to the needs of future generations.
All right, we're going to open up the discussion to journalists from around the world, as I said at the beginning. Catherine Duan, this is a question from her. She's not here in Vision. She's the North American Bureau Chief from Sina Finance in China. Ayla, her question is, in terms of the impact of expanding aid funding, how should international financial institutions work together to address climate change?
Well, aid financing is one thing that is made more like grants. I think lending is something that what our kind of institutions do. I think one of the problems is still to find the absorption capacity in the poorer countries. I mean, we have medium income countries and then we have poorer countries, but there is especially this absorption capacity. You need a lot of just holding the hand and telling how to do things. And this actually requires quite a lot of resources, I have learned in the past 1 year or 2 year, even now institution. It needs a lot of manpower, it needs a lot of expertise. So that is one thing. Of course, we all need capital in order to operate in higher risk countries, and that we can basically only get from our shareholders. So you can't really do anything for free. It all comes down to those resources.
All right. I mean, Jules, what investment and financing criteria would be effective to promote environmental protection is the other question from Catherine.
The fundamental question that we have to be clear about, that we have to address, that we have disclosure on, is carbon intensity of the products and services that we use across our economy. So it is, in the end, the number one criteria is going to be how much carbon do you emit to produce any service or any good in our economy. If we get transparency on that, we can start to make differentiated decisions.
All right, let's move on. We have a question from Dr. Olukayode Oyeleye, consulting editor at Business AM Nigeria. Please go ahead briefly with your question. I think the screen has frozen, but I do actually conveniently have his question here. Let me read it to you while we get him back. Africa is overwhelmingly responsible for the raw materials that power green economies in the developed world. For example, Nigeria produces much of the uranium that powers the French nuclear power industry. How equitable is the global push for green energy in this case? Katerina?
Well, I think the question already implies that it's not very equitable,
Yeah.
right? Africa also has been the source for all a lot of the brown energy, oil in particular. But I think the extraction that then of the resources, bringing them back into the West, and then turning around, saying, no, we will have to help you and hold your hand while you learn how to use green energy, has sort of a slight post-colonial, neo-colonial touch to it. So it's, I think, recognizing again where the resources come from and pricing that accordingly and making sure that the societies in Africa, in the different countries, are sharing the gains from new technologies, and not only because they're getting aid, but because actually it's the resources that belong to them that are being used for it would be important.
Jules?
Yeah, but I'd love to build on that with a positive note as well. There's a tremendous opportunity for Africa to leapfrog from the fossil fuel technologies of the past straight away to the clean energy technologies, particularly solar, of the future. And what we couldn't imagine 10 years ago is now all across Africa, electricity generated with solar and batteries will be cost competitive. So there is also a positive note for countries like sub-Saharan Africa to leapfrog to the technology of the future.
May, your response?
I agree with what Katerina said, and also Jules, about this incredible transformation that's possible and in fact is happening. I would also say that what we see movements as an incredible demand for clean energy. So I'll give an example of the Lamu coal plant in Kenya. This would have been the first coal plant to be built in Kenya, and activists came together to say, this way, we want to develop in a way that doesn't make climate change worse, make our health worse, poison our water. So movements are driving these changes.
Okay, May, we just lost you a little bit at the end, but we heard most of you. Ayla, what about this issue of how equitable is the global push for green energy?
That for a capital market person like myself is probably a very big question. But I think what Jules was saying is very interesting, that there are huge resources also in the emerging market countries. Well, let's think about very simplistically. Solar energy, the money of these countries are located in zones where sun is plenty, unlike in Northern Europe. So I think it's really about who benefits from what and who pays for what and who earns what. This is the big question, rather than, I mean, resources are definitely there and they should be used in a fair and just manner.
Right. Do you agree with that? I could see you nodding away there, Katerina.
Yes, I think we could also think of mechanism to make sure that this is going to happen, but it's not going to happen within the current framework of basically transferring these resources to the West first and then selling back expensive technologies.
Hugh?
Look, I think that how we finance emerging market transformation is incredibly important. One area we haven't spoken about so far is the World Bank and other developmental banks. These are typically the pivotal institutions to help finance. Last year, they represented about 200 billion of finance for green projects. I would hope that can double or triple. And I think one of the things I'm really would like to see out of COP is to see a significant increase in developmental banks lending to emerging markets.
You're showing some skepticism there, Jules.
Yeah, I agree with you that MDBs, financial institutions, international financial institutions have an important role to play. But this transition is going to require capital at a scale that is beyond the balance sheets of even the largest MDBs. So we need to crowd in private sector capital at a very large scale, and your bank and all the other financial institutions in the world will have to be playing a crucial role, bringing private sector finance to bear, and also mobilizing domestic savings in these countries.
Hugh?
I'm afraid Jules and I are in agreement. So if I go back to the number I used at the beginning, if it really is $3.5 trillion of investment each and every year for the next decade to rewire the economy, it's the auto systems, utilities, cement, everything. That 200 billion just from development banks is nowhere near enough. We are going to have to work together, both private capital, public capital, and putting the two together at scale. And certainly for me, the focus on emerging markets is incredibly important. One of the disappointments of last year during the pandemic is the flows of capital to emerging markets went down by about 20% because everyone, in a cautious year, people retrenched. What we need to do is actually lean into that and actually increase rather than decrease the support to emerging markets.
All right, well, thank you for that question. We have a question here from the editor of Seri in Brazil, from Wesley Satales Guerra. His question is, when we talk about green capitalism, we always think of big companies and projects. However, could the role of family farming act as a fixer of population in rural areas and allies for new sustainability policies? May? I think May might be frozen there. Katerina, I'll put it to you instead. We've lost her.
Yes, so I think helping small and medium-sized enterprises, family farms, etc., to adapt to climate needs and change their productions is really important. But we also have to realize, of course, that they're very often part of global supply chains that are driven by big companies that want to import to the Western markets, and their flexibility might be limited by that as well. So it's probably not enough to give them more money, but we also have to think about the constraints under which they are currently operating. But I generally sort of support the idea of not sort of giving more subsidies to the big players, but making sure that the smaller players have the support that they need to make this kind of transition.
Before I move on to the next question, I'm going to try May again. Did you hear the question, first of all, May?
It was about the role of smallholder farmers in Brazil?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So we focus much more on the role of activists in those regions who are fighting fossil fuels, but absolutely.
Oh, what a shame. It seems to have frozen again. That line is being a pain. Never mind. I'll leave it just for the moment and we'll go on to our final question from journalist Ali Kayala, editor, Gazette, Oxygen in Turkey. Please go ahead with your question.
Hello, everyone. Actually, I have two questions. One is about carbon pricing. Do you really think that carbon pricing will eventually take an efficient shape? Or do you believe in the criticism that it's just creating a passport for the polluters to keep polluting?
Ella?
And
let's do that one first, and I'll come back to you. Ella.
Okay, that's better.
All right. I think I think it would be efficient in the way that, yes, you can keep polluting, but you keep paying up. It means that people who finance you or your shareholders, they will see that, well, the financial risks of this company are growing because carbon price is going up, and they use carbon like they did before, and they are not trying to tone it down. So this means that your future perspectives look gloomier, and your financiers and your equity holders will just go elsewhere. So, and this is usually, if you need to talk to big money, put the other big money talking to them, and this usually works quickest.
Jules?
Yeah, I agree. I think that if you look particularly at the carbon-intensive sectors, cement, steel, the price of carbon, even at a modest level already at 25, let alone at 50 euros where the carbon price is in Europe right now, that has a real impact on their bottom line. So no, it will be much more than just an excuse to continue to pollute.
Ali, Hugh, did you want to say something?
No, I very much agree. I mean, I've been part of this, the new sort of task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, and I agree with Jules that as the price comes through, it's a tax. I think, Joe, yourself said that how much companies spend on trying to minimise their tax bill. A carbon tax will be an intense focus for boards. Doesn't mean there won't be still some companies who try to pay, just in the same way that people sinning in the Middle Ages paid for their sins. I think but on the whole, the higher the carbon price, the more impactful these markets will be on company behaviour.
Katerina?
Yes, if the price is right, then it works. If the price is not right, it doesn't. And I think we've seen sort of that carbon has been underpriced for a long period of time. And so that we just really have to put our hope into the market doing its job there. And I'm not sure it's enough. I think I would also sort of push a little bit more from the government side.
Ali, your second question. Just hang on a second. Either you need to unmute yourself or we need to fade you up. I think we can hear you now.
I think I'm back. Okay. The other question is about the effect of populist policies on the efforts to push companies to cut their carbon emissions. And do you think that especially emerging economies face a risk of rising populist policies, which would be a real setback in efforts to fight the climate crisis? And in this concept, would you believe that financial measures would lead Turkey to adopt the Paris Agreement, one of the 6 countries who haven't yet?
Ayla, what do you think? Financial measures work in the case of Turkey?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the whole question because line kept cutting off. I think I got the part where it says if the effect of populist policies
yes,
have an impact. I think, well, yes and no. Of course, it does have some impact. But I'll take the example of the United States, where we had 4 years of rather populist policies. Green finance and the concern about environment, for example, with investors, didn't go away during those 4 years. It may have gone in some parts, but investors and those who were interested, they kept pushing even more, feeling that they didn't get the federal support. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this decides everything. Of course, it will decide the government policies, and most populist movements seem to be sort of against climate change and don't want to hear about it. Against climate change fight, I would say.
Right, Katerina, do you agree with that?
Yes, I think I do in large parts. I think, politics play a big role, and the way in which also governments and, of course, civil society organizations prepare the population to make sure that they understand what we are up against. But they, of course, can use it also a tool for their own politics, which is why I think we really have to watch the interaction between big business in different countries and the government, and how they're pushing for public opinion to go in a particular way that might be counterproductive for what we're trying to achieve. So I think in that sense, of course, the market plays an important role because it might add an additional vector here by carbon prices going up if they're going up high enough. But the politics are, as I said earlier, treacherous because of the abuse of this particular topic also in the broader landscape of electoral politics in different countries.
Ali, thank you very much for your questions there in Turkey, because that's all we have time for now. Thank you to all of the panellists and the questioners for taking part for that fascinating discussion. Don't forget, next Monday, October the 20th, at the same time, you can tune in for the second instalment of Project Syndicate's Climate Week coverage, Building the Green Consensus. Do register now at the Project Syndicate website. But fear not, there's still more to come today. Still to come, we have Mark Mallock-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations, Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, Andrew Steer, CEO of Bezos Earth Fund, and Laurence Toubiana is CEO of European Climate Foundation. All that before our closing remarks from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. And to round up this session, here's Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London.
With COP26 just a few weeks away, it's vitally important that cities, local and national governments reach a consensus on the bold action that's required to tackle the climate emergency. Here in London, we're seeing the impact of the twin dangers of climate change and toxic air pollution. We're setting the ambitious target of making London a zero-carbon city by 2030. And I'm committed to a Green New Deal for London, which puts the environment at the centre of London's recovery. This will address head-on the economic and social challenges presented by the pandemic by bringing new investment to London, helping businesses to see long-term growth and providing decent, skilled local jobs. Our world-leading ultra-low emission zone is helping to bring down emissions and clean up our air, reducing some of the most harmful forms of air pollution in central London by almost a half. And we're expanding this successful clean air zone to be 18 times larger in just a few weeks' time. With more of our citizens living in cities than ever before, this century is often described as the century of the city. What we've achieved in London to date illustrates the value of strong local authorities and regional government in delivering real change. And working together, cities must redouble our efforts, work together to convince national governments to unleash our potential and ensure that our citizens come with us on this journey. But this decade must be one of action. As leaders, we'll be judged on deeds, not words. We need to face the climate emergency with even greater urgency, renewed ambition and commitment. As we look to rebuild after this devastating pandemic, ensure a fairer, cleaner and greener future for our citizens.
Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London. Now that's it for our second session. We'll be taking a short break. See you in a minute.
Climate change is now on the agenda of every company and financial institution around the world. There's a growing recognition that both the physical risks associated with climate change and the challenges and risks associated with the transition to a low-carbon future need to be on the agenda and need to be the focus of management and leadership of businesses all around the world. At RMI, we work to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. Our mission is to help businesses and industries, cities and states, governments and policymakers drive the transition towards a zero-carbon energy future. In order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next decade, the energy system needs to be transformed. Energy represents almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And so, whereas it is 70% of the problem, it also needs to be 70% of the solution. Nobody can pretend that they can, on their own, find the solutions for the energy transition. This is a complex and massive challenge. So in all the work that we do, we look for partners and collaborators. We team up with other civil society organizations. We love to work with businesses, financial institutions to drive the change at a much higher pace.
If we respect the environment, it will respect us. So we all have to play our part.
We were really in trouble of losing some species in my lifetime. And this can wreak havoc on the balance of the ecosystem.
People need nature, and people must take care of nature.
I am part of the next generation that have to make sure that this place survives.
It is our responsibility as the two-leggeds to try to foster good relationships with the earth. And it's beginning now.
Climate change is now on the agenda of every company and financial institution around the world. There's a growing recognition that both the physical risks associated with climate change and the challenges and risks associated with the transition to a low-carbon future need to be on the agenda and need to be the focus of management and leadership of businesses all around the world. At RMI, we work to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. Our mission is to help businesses and industries, cities and states, governments and policymakers drive the transition towards a zero-carbon energy future. In order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next decade, the energy system needs to be transformed. Energy represents almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And so, whereas it is 70% of the problem, it also needs to be 70% of the solution. Nobody can pretend that they can, on their own, find the solutions for the energy transition. This is a complex and massive challenge. So in all the work that we do, we look for partners and collaborators. We team up with other civil society organizations. We love to work with businesses, financial institutions to drive the change at a much higher pace.
If we respect the environment, it will respect us. So we all have to play our part.
We were really in trouble of losing some species in my lifetime. And this can wreak havoc on the balance of the ecosystem.
People need nature, and people must take care of nature.
I am part of the next generation that have to make sure that this place survives.
It is our responsibility as the two-leggeds to try to foster good relationships with the earth. And it's beginning now.
Climate change is now on the agenda of every company and financial institution around the world. There's a growing recognition that both the physical risks associated with climate change and the challenges and risks associated with the transition to a low-carbon future need to be on the agenda and need to be the focus of management and leadership of businesses all around the world. At RMI, we work to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. Our mission is to help businesses and industries, cities and states, governments and policymakers drive the transition towards a zero-carbon energy future. In order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next decade, the energy system needs to be transformed. Energy represents almost 70% of greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And so, whereas it is 70% of the problem, it also needs to be 70% of the solution. Nobody can pretend that they can, on their own, find the solutions for the energy transition. This is a complex.
Hello again. I'm Jo Coburn and welcome back to the third and final session today, where we'll be hearing from Mark Mallet-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations, Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, Andrew Steer, CEO of Bezos Earth Fund, and Lawrence Tubiana, the CEO of European Climate Foundation. All that before our closing remarks from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. Now, today's final session is about the role of civic society. With so much focus on governments and businesses, what role can NGOs, philanthropists and ordinary people play in driving a green transition? Well, one place to start, of course, is by using the hashtag #NewSummits and helping spread the word about today's event. But there are tougher challenges ahead, and to help guide us through is Mark Mallet-Brown, President of the Open Society Foundations.
I'm here as the president of the Open Society Foundations, an organization which bears the scar of many a political battle. We've fought for human rights and democracy around the world. We were in Eastern and Central Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall. We were in apartheid South Africa, engaged in the political change. There hasn't been a fight for social rights around the world, whether it's been LGBTQ, or a woman's right to choice, or migrants' social rights and employment, those of care workers left out of formal economy protections. We've been in the forefront of all these struggles as the world's biggest human rights foundation. We're at a moment where we're reassessing our impact. How can we best protect human rights in the world? And we've realized that alongside the traditional threats, political, social, economic, and corporate that we have addressed, lies a new threat, climate. A threat which falls on victims who are, in a sense, not the source of the issue. The big polluters in the world still have not been hit in their pocketbooks. Indeed, there are subsidies to fossil-based fuels which allow them to continue too often largely unconstrained in their behaviors. But the disproportionate victims are those who are, in most cases, themselves near zero emitters. People who are living marginal existences in slums and barrios, where the absence of clean water, the quality of public services is already making their lives highly vulnerable. Together with their counterparts who stayed in an increasingly precarious agricultural existence on ever more marginal lands. It's these groups who bear the impact of other people's emissions. And so as we've looked at the funding allocation of our foundation peers, we've seen disproportionate funds going to mitigation in the global north and inadequate funds going to adaptation in the global south. So while part of our strategy going forward does focus on a very northern issue, how we can support the advocacy efforts in North America, Europe, and hopefully over time China to really drive a leveling of the global playing field, a move towards a zero emissions future. That advocacy is something we will continue to support. Beyond that, it is to our colleagues and friends and grantees and those we seek to serve in the developing world that we want to apply the majority of our support in this area of climate. We are working heavily already in the towns of the Amazon to help people organize to address the impact of deforestation on their livelihoods. We're working on building more resilient lives in the Caribbean, a region deeply affected by climate change, where critical sectors of its economy, like tourism, are potentially at risk. We're engaging in South Africa, where a just energy transition from the fossil-based power system of today to a renewables future is one of the great political economy struggles that that nation faces. And with all of these engagements, we have an eye to their wider application across other parts of the global south. We stand with you all in solidarity as a human rights organization which has concluded that climate is at the heart of future fights for rights.
Mark Mallet-Brown there outlining some of the challenges ahead. Now I'm delighted to hand over to three extremely qualified guests for this afternoon's fireside chat. Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, welcome to you. Andrew Steer, President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, and Lawrence Tubiana, CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Welcome to all of you and welcome to New Summits. Now I'm going to hand over to you. You don't need me to interfere and intervene in what will, I'm sure, be a fascinating conversation between the three of you. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Jennifer, first of all, to start them off.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. It's wonderful to be here. And thanks, Project Syndicate, for hosting this incredible conversation with two dear colleagues, Andrew Steer and, of course, Lawrence Tubiana. I'm just so excited to be here with you. So I wanted to just mention, and maybe following on from Mark Mallet-Brown's terrific video just now, to really make sure that everyone listening today understands that we have got to go from talk to action. This has got to be the decade of action, not only to support all of the incredible work on adaptation, as Mark just mentioned, but of course to really address the fact that we still have time to stop the climate crisis. And I wanted to just mention, of course, you all have seen or heard about the IPCC report. Just to mention a couple of things, we are absolutely in the midst of an unprecedented experiment with our planet. It hasn't warmed this fast any time before in human history. CO2 levels haven't been this high for at least 3 million years, and we haven't seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this fast ever. But there is hope, a tremendous amount of hope, and the three organizations represented here, of course, are part of that transition to hope. My organization, the Nature Conservancy, is really focused on three big things that I just wanted to highlight, and then I will ask my fellow panelists to jump in. And the first is, we here in the United States are on the brink of what could be the most important policy change in the history of this country when it comes to the climate crisis, and that is getting a price on carbon. So I have a background in economics and firmly believe that if we don't have a price on carbon, our society will not move fast enough to make the changes that are needed for innovation. And to do that, we need to make sure that any pricing regime that we have, of course, supports the just transition and includes ensuring that it's revenue neutral, that funding that would go to disadvantaged communities is there as part of this policy driver. But I'm very hopeful that this week here in the United States, there is actually hope for the first time we could see a real price on carbon as part of the reconciliation package that's going through. So that's number one. Number two is when we think about renewable energy, we have to make sure that the renewable energy that we're installing across the world is done so in a way that supports biodiversity. And I've seen this firsthand when solar panels or wind installations are done without thinking about land, or we're not siting them appropriately, they do undermine our planet's natural capital. So I'm very excited to also mention that here in the United States, in Virginia, we just announced an incredible partnership with Dominion Energy, a utility here in the state of Virginia, to actually site a huge solar installation, 50 megawatts of solar power on a former coal mine that has been reclaimed and restored. That land has no biodiversity on it. We're going to put the solar installation there, and we're doing this kind of work in India and many other places. So I'm absolutely thrilled to see the focus on renewable energy, but we have to make sure that we site that energy appropriately so it doesn't undermine biodiversity. And then finally, Indigenous people. I just came from Marseille and the incredible IUCN conference there. I want to just highlight the importance of making sure that as we think about building back better and really building back different, that we are ensure that Indigenous people and disadvantaged communities around the world, Black and Brown communities, are at the table. Whether that has to do with how we're doing 30 by 30, which is to protect 30% of the planet by 2030, Indigenous people must be at the table. And that is just so important as we think about going forward in the world ahead. So with that, I want to turn it over to my wonderful panelist, Mr. Andrew Steer, who is now the CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. And as Andrew, you think about the role of Jeff Bezos as an incredible new philanthropist, how do you see the foundation pivoting into this decade of action ahead on climate and biodiversity?
Well, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Project Syndicate, and how great to see Laurence as well. We all work together. Jennifer, what you're doing in TNC is wonderful, and that's why we are so proud to be able to support some of your work. Bezos Earth Fund is supporting some of your remarkable work on nature conservation. And of course, addressing nature is one of the most important things we need to do to address climate change as well. You're also introducing incredible technologies into agriculture in India, for example, with Bezos Earth Fund money, and we are absolutely thrilled to do this. Look, in today's world, we need all hands on deck. There's not a silver bullet. Be nice if governments could solve problems. They can't. Be nice if the corporate sector could solve problems. They can't. None of us individually can solve problems. It takes a jigsaw puzzle. And each of us have a very special role to play. And one of the sort of really encouraging developments recently has been the emergence of truly generous philanthropists. And obviously, Jeff Bezos is a remarkable example of this. A year ago, he decided $10 billion to be spent this decade in grants to address climate and nature. And the way we look at it is the same as the way you would look at it, Jen. I mean, it is in this decade, we have to at least halve carbon emissions, for example. We now have a carbon intensity in the upper atmosphere greater than we've ever had for the last 2 million years. We have the last decade is the hottest decade we've had in 125,000 years. So we're in unprecedented territory. And what we've been told by the world's best scientists is that we have about 10 to 15 years more where we can continue to pollute the way we are. If we keep polluting at the same rate we're doing it now, 12 years from today, we will have used up our carbon budget and we will have lost a realistic chance of doing what we need to do. And so that's why someone like Jeff Bezos said, look, this is the decade. And in this decade, we need a whole bunch of revolutions. And we know the big ones, energy and food systems and transportation and manufacturing and consumption. And within each of those, there are 3 or 4 others. We've got to get rid of the internal combustion engine. We've got to halve food loss and waste. We've got to switch diets towards plant-based. We've got to do a whole bunch of important things, including reforming financial systems. So what we're doing as a philanthropy, we're looking at all of these. There are about 50 such transformations. And some of them are doing fine, don't need any help from us. Some of them are stuck in the mud. Some of them are doing okay, but there are various blockages. And what the job of a philanthropy is to do is to work with other members of civil society and scientists and advocates and protesters and corporations in order to remove those blockages. And that's what we're trying to do this decisive decade. But look, I'd love to turn to Laurence, because you in some ways are sort of the, I was going to say, mother of multi-stakeholder engagement in the climate negotiations. When you were running COP21, the great Paris meeting, you're the one who really brought in both corporate sector, NGOs, philanthropists. And since then, we've seen a real flowering of the role of these players. I'd love to hear from you. Talk a little bit about the journey that we've been on. Are you encouraged right now?
Thank you, Andrew, for putting that in perspective. As of course, as Jennifer and you said, this is a decade. We can still do something. There of course, a big difference between 2 degrees C and 1.5. So this urgency is there. When I built the Paris Agreement system, in a way, I felt that, as you said, there is no silver bullet. The government cannot do alone. They would not be courageous enough or inspired enough to drive the change. The corporates the same. No, they would try to delay action most of the time because they are afraid of the consequences. And so the idea was we need all hands on deck with the same level of pressure. We need to put the system under a constraint that is, of course, a carbon budget. And that's why we need, in a way, everyone to take commitments to look at the same objectives, the net zero emission by 2050 and this halving emission by 2030 for everyone. And that asking the new notion that the non-state actors can bring together. They are not bound by an agreement. It's not the text that is important, it's the objective and the slope and the direction of travel. And then what is interesting is the problem of agency. This is everything. We need citizen agency to make the change. We need ownership of citizens for having the social change. Jennifer was talking about the indigenous people, central for the biodiversity protection as well as the fight against climate change. So I think we have to, in a way, decentralize the system from governments to, of course, all actors taking engagement, being accountable. And that's where I think civil society can help, in a way, put the pressure on everyone to be honest and truthful. And at the same time, understand that the dynamic of the change, the fear, the anxiety that we feel in the citizen mind today vis-a-vis climate change and biodiversity loss would be transformed into positive energy if we can, in a way, gather that energy and turn it into a force. And that was ownership and that's where, of course, civil society can do a lot. And I recognize the enormous efforts that Jennifer is doing it on organization, or you are doing, Andrew, with this new drive to really put the elements into the civil society hands to mobilize all these forces of the youth, of the citizen, of the civil society, of the justice movement. I think that will put then the pressure on, the investors, the corporates, the local authorities, which already was embarked in Paris, but now has to deliver. And we see this flourish of this commitment to net zero being inspired by the Paris Agreement, but now we need, of course, the civil society to, in a way, put this system into the constraint of the decisive decade. So that's really the one team element, the one team thinking. It's in my view, very, very exciting. And of course, I would be curious to know, both of you, how you feel that this connection between the different silos of our society, the different parts are coming together, and what the kind of messages or communication or mobilization we can create that, in a way, make everyone work in interaction with this type of accountability that we need, because that will make the pressure you are talking about, Jennifer, even for the US government, we need so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to share my thoughts on that, and I'd love to hear Andrew's as well, of course. So I think you're absolutely right, Laurence. It's critical, especially now as we think about government's challenge coming out of COVID. Still, so many countries are deep in the middle of of the crisis and will continue for some time, every single philanthropic dollar that's spent or public money that's spent has to be managed in a way that it's going to hit multiple things, ideally, right? So I think the time is over, that climate is over here and biodiversity is over here when we're talking about environmental issues. We have to spend every dollar in the most effective and efficient way possible. And that means, to the extent that we can, bringing those two together. So I mentioned the energy issue, ensuring that our renewable energy installations don't undermine biodiversity. I would also say that certainly when it comes to agriculture, as we think about integrating, and there's a big summit, of course, coming up, the Food Systems Summit, integrating agricultural production and the need to ensure that as we evolve as a society after COVID, that we are providing the necessary food resources that limit waste, but also provide for communities who absolutely are food insecure. So doing that means we have to be consistently focused on preserving nature and optimizing our land use in a way that takes advantage of degraded lands and technologies that will enable us to become more efficient on current land. So there's lots of work happening in this space. And I think that we've got to make sure that we as a community don't silo ourselves. We have these different conventions and different treaties, of course, but that we as civil society need to continuously be promoting those messages, which are holistic, and look at more systemic change. So Andrew, from your perspective, is that something the Bezos Earth Fund is looking at as well?
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And I think what Lawrence was saying is absolutely right. If you ask, what do we really need? We need change to become irresistible and unstoppable across a whole range of transitions. And in order to do that, we need different players to play their role, to know what their contribution is. And their role will differ according to the situation. So, for example, for philanthropy, and indeed for you as a leading NGO, what one has to ask in any particular revolution that's taking place, one needs to ask where in the sort of, if you like, the entire sort of soup to nuts here, can we play a role? It could be in primary research. It could be driving down cost curves in the hydrogen economy, or in carbon absorbing roots of food crops, which is what we're financing. One of the things we're financing now could be research. At the other end of the spectrum, it could be financing political advocacy, supporting people out on the street, supporting a direct political lobbying to get certain policies adopted, as you were talking about, whether it's a carbon price or whether it's investing more money in public research on long gestation batteries, for example. And in between, there's all kinds of other kind of entry points that may be needed. So, for example, in some cases, helping to make a market. So we're financing, for example, the emerging, we hope, market for seaweed as a major food crop. Japan does it. Why don't we? It's incredibly nutritious. It's wonderful for the environment. It absorbs carbon, and it's better for you. So but often you have to involve in a sort of a nudge to get a market developed. In other cases, we can be involved, if you like, in helping risk management in renewable energy in Africa, for example. Difficult to get enough private investment. We have a role there. In other places, we might have a role in say, monitoring and accountability systems. So, for example, we're financing satellite technology with EDF to measure methane emissions at point source, and we're also financing the World Resources Institute to do what's called the Land and Carbon Lab, which will measure down to 1 hectare every single week the carbon flux, carbon coming down into trees and bushes and crops and soils, and carbon going up in the sky as bad things are happening down here on Earth. And so we all have to ask ourselves, what is our role that we can play to get across that tipping point to make change unstoppable? Laurence, you're interesting because you are both a foundation, so you actually make money available to others, but you're also an activist, brilliant NGO, if you like, yourselves, doing remarkable analytical and political work. How do you balance that?
You know, I think the notion is how we leverage on each other action, and when it's pressure, when it is dialogue, when it is inside, when outside. The flexibility, I like, Andrew, your vision. You look at the map of the problems and then you try to point where we can have an impact immediately. And what I'm doing is really seeing, for example, in one particular circumstance, let's say we need really a new regulation on coal in Poland or somewhere else, how we combine the litigation with the youth taking the street with a dialogue with the government and even the companies that would propose a solution. And this, I think, if we are clever enough, if we are the collective intelligence we can deploy, just to push on all these pressure points, like, we have a big plane to start off and we need really to have the dashboard. Every light has to be green. That was my concept with Paris Agreement. So we need the leverage point. Maybe these investors at that particular moment to have, blended finance you are trying to work at, Andrew, or it is really the political pressures that really is changing, for example, the German election, where climate change now is part of the programs, which is really unprecedented. And so I think what we have to do in this particular moment is to mobilize all this intelligence and very quickly understand when we can support Jennifer, particularly in this, picking the good places where to put renewable energy and not elsewhere, and to help you in designing the new economic thinking you are really brainstorming about, or helping us to really mobilize this youth and making that the European Commission, is normally a bureaucratic institution, feel obliged to go to a Green Deal, which is really, really ambitious. So that, I feel, the community now has to be much more connected and more quick, and just stop, of course, working in silo, but understand where the pressure points are, and we need the influence map, and then really decide how we focus. And unfortunately, we have to do it very, very quickly now because we don't have time.
Could I ask, Jennifer, I wanted to ask you a question based upon that, because Laurence is absolutely right that that we need partnerships, and they need to be smart partnerships. Now, you're one of the biggest environmental NGOs in the world. Maybe you're the biggest. It's fantastic how you've grown and what you're doing. How do you decide? But at the same time, so we all need partnerships. I mean, none of us can, however big we are or small we are, we can't do it on our own. You need partnerships. But if they're too inclusive, the transactions costs rise quite a lot, and you can have just lots of meetings. How do you go about thinking about who your partner should be? Governments, corporations, other NGOs, scientists, and so on.
Yeah, so that's a really important question, and I know I have about a minute to answer it. So maybe I'll just say that the Nature Conservancy prides itself on what we call radical partnerships. So basically working with the institutions, be they local, hyper-local NGOs, Indigenous groups. We work a lot with Native American communities here in the US and Australia and Canada, all over the world, as well as big companies. And we take the approach of, sometimes we have to get out of our comfort zone and also work with other organizations that we would consider to be our competitors. And as you know, Andrew, we have a wonderful collaboration with my colleagues from World Wildlife Fund and Pew and others, and Conservation International as well, we have fantastic relationships with. So we have to do everything we can to make sure we have the right people at the table. As you say, you have to make sure that it's done in an efficient way and decision-making is streamlined, but it's all about building that trust. And I think that's something that I'm committed to as a leader with my team, is ensuring that we know we have to work together. We absolutely have no choice, no option, no time to be committing, to be competing. It's just, we've run out of time. So being able to do that is really critical. I see we have also run out of time. So before I throw it back to Joe, I just want to pick up on one thing you said, Laurence, which I think is so important, and that is the youth. And I will steal a quote from Harrison Ford, who said something that was very powerful and resonated with the entire audience at the IUCN conference last week, which is, reinforcements are coming. And he was speaking specifically about the youth and how we as civil society have to keep businesses and governments honest, and the youth has to keep us honest. We have to make sure that we know that every day, my 13-year-old, actually she turned 14 today, all of the children around the world are telling us, you have to do better for us. So that is our charge. I really loved this conversation. And maybe we do have 1 minute left. Andrew, Laurence, any final words from you?
I think honesty and truth is a dominant thing, and crisis mode, if I may say. I should be able to take the call you immediately telling Jennifer, I need that support in that particular place now, and you should do the same. So truth, honesty, because we need to really create that trust and capacity to interact super quickly.
And partnerships will work when we are humble, when we look ourselves in the mirror, when we don't try to fly our own flag, but we wake up on a Monday morning focused on the job at hand and take joy in accomplishing that rather than pride in ourselves or what we're doing.
Well said. Thank you so much. Joe, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, the three of you. What a great discussion. Fantastic to get your insights. Jennifer Morris, Andrew Steer and Laurence Toubiana, and lots of optimism too, I thought, in that discussion. Now, with so much talk about this autumn's COP conference in Glasgow, Scotland, what better way to round off today's events than by hearing from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland. Here she is.
In less than 2 months' time, world leaders will gather in my home city of Glasgow for the COP26 summit. This represents the world's best chance, possibly our last chance, to meet the promises the world made at Paris 6 years ago. Glasgow, of course, is a very fitting venue. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was famously a birthplace of the industrial age. And in years to come, I hope we will speak of it as a place where the world made a decisive step towards the net zero age and reached a turning point in the fight against climate change. COP26 must result not just in national plans, but in actions. Actions that together create a pathway for keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. These actions must be underpinned by principles of fairness, climate justice, and ensuring a just transition. And as part of that, developed countries must meet their obligations to climate finance, including support for those most affected. Delivering these aims is, above all else, an overwhelming moral and environmental imperative. If we don't act, sea level rises and extreme weather events such as floods, droughts and associated fires will cause catastrophic impacts. All of us will be affected, but the world's poorest and most vulnerable will pay the heaviest price. But the transition to net zero is also a massive opportunity. It gives us a chance to reduce pollution, restore our natural environment, and create good, highly skilled green jobs in the products and services of the future. Scotland is trying to lead by example. Since 1990, we have more than halved our greenhouse gas emissions. By the end of this decade, we will have reduced them by 75%. And then we're aiming for net zero emissions by 2045. We're also trying to ensure that our transition is a just one, both here in Scotland and internationally. To deliver those ambitions, we work closely with businesses and civil society. We have recently set up a public investment bank. One of its key missions is to support the transition to net zero. And we're attracting private finance through a tailored green investment portfolio. We also work with partners around the world. In particular, we are a proud member of the Under 2 Coalition, a worldwide community of 220 governments which aren't UN member states and so can't formally be represented at COP. However, all of the coalition members have a vital role to play in tackling the climate crisis. In recent years, we've seen extraordinary technological advances in low carbon and net zero technologies. But governments must show the political will to translate that innovation into the action that will make a difference. In doing so, we should bear in mind one of the key lessons of the past 2 years. During the pandemic, actions which previously seemed impossible suddenly became achievable. People changed their behaviour drastically to protect themselves and each other. New testing infrastructures were created from scratch. Vaccines have been developed at record speed because governments, businesses and research institutes poured money into their development. We now need to summon the same urgency we've shown in the face of a pandemic to tackle the climate crisis, which is the greatest challenge the world faces. If we can achieve that, as I hope and believe we will, then COP26 will indeed mark a turning point. It will mark a decisive shift in our efforts to tackle the climate crisis, and it will put the world on course for a much better and a more sustainable future.
Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland. Now that's all we have time for today, but we're only halfway through Project Syndicate's Climate Week coverage. Tune in next Monday, September the 20th at the same time for Building the Green Consensus. You can register now at the Project Syndicate website. There's just time left to say thank you once again to all our contributors, the people working behind the scenes, but most of all to you for watching. I'm Jo Coburn, and that was New Summits, brought to you by Project Syndicate.